The rain in Boston did not sound like anything to Judge Elias Corder. For the past 10 years, rain was nothing more than a visual pattern of grey streaks slashing against the thick, reinforced glass of the federal courthouse windows. It was a cold, silent film. The thunder that rattled the window panes was merely a vibration he felt in the soles of his polished leather shoes, a dull tremor traveling up his shins. Inside courtroom 4, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air conditioning hummed, or so Elias assumed by the way the defense attorney's stray hairs danced near the vent. But for Elias, there was only the void. It was a silence so absolute, so heavy, that it felt like being buried under 6 feet of snow. The only disruption was the high-pitched phantom whine of tinnitus, a neurological scar left by the car bomb that had taken his hearing and his wife a decade ago. That sound was his only companion, a cruel reminder of what had been taken. Elias sat high upon his bench, a figure carved from marble and bitterness. He adjusted the heavy black fabric of his robe. Before him sat a small brass plaque, polished to a mirror shine, facing the lawyers and the gallery. The engraving was stark and non-negotiable. Judge Corder is profoundly deaf. All arguments must be submitted in writing. He did not look at faces anymore. Faces lied. Tears could be faked. Trembling chins could be rehearsed. Elias looked at paper. He looked at the real-time transcription screen on his desk, where the court stenographer turned human tragedy into cold, scrolling text. Text did not lie. Text had no inflection. It was pure law. Today was the sentencing hearing for case number 492, the State versus Peter Antunes. Elias's eyes drifted to the defendant. Peter Antunes was a man who looked like he had been eroded by the wind. He was 38 years old, but looked 50. He was a local artisan, a woodworker known for restoring historic homes in Beacon Hill. His hands, currently resting on the defense table, were thick, scarred, and stained with varnish, the hands of a creator, not a thief. But the scrolling text on Elias's screen told a different story. Embezzlement of $40,000 from the Hayes Charity Foundation. Evidence includes digital transfer logs, forged receipts found in the defendant's workshop. Elias shifted his gaze to the gallery. In the front row, wearing a suit that cost more than Peter Antunes earned in a year, sat Mark Hayes, the real estate tycoon, the philanthropist, the accuser. Hayes sat with the relaxed posture of a predator who knows the cage is locked. He checked his watch, bored. Elias felt a flicker of distaste for the man's arrogance. But feelings were not facts. The facts were on the screen. The receipts were in the file. Peter Antunes was guilty. Elias picked up his fountain pen. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. He looked down at the verdict sheet. It was time to end this. It was time to uphold the letter of the law, the only thing in the world that still made sense to him. The courtroom was packed today. The press loved a story about a fallen blue-collar hero stealing from orphans. Elias could see the reporters leaning forward, hungry for the final soundbite. He watched the prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Dalloway, stand up and move her mouth. Elias looked at the screen. "Your Honor, the people ask for the maximum sentence. This was a betrayal of trust." Elias nodded once, curtly. He began to write. The nib of his pen scratched against the paper, a vibration he felt in his fingertips. G-U-I-L-T-Y. But he never finished the word. A movement in the center aisle caught his peripheral vision. It was a disruption in the flow of the room, a ripple in the stagnant water. Elias looked up, his brow furrowing. A child was standing there. She was small, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. She wore a woolen coat that was 2 sizes too big, the cuffs rolled up to reveal thin, pale wrists. Her hair was a tangle of dark curls, damp from the Boston rain. This was Clara Antunes, the daughter. The files stated she had been present when the SWAT team raided their small apartment 3 months ago. The psychological report noted that she had not spoken a single word since that night. Selective mutism induced by acute trauma. The bailiff, a large man named Officer Miller, stepped forward, his hand reaching out to intercept her. Elias saw Miller's mouth moving, shouting probably, but the girl did not flinch. She did not look at the bailiff. She did not look at her father, who had half risen from his chair, his face twisted in a silent scream of panic. She looked only at Elias. There was something in her eyes that stopped Elias cold. It was not fear. It was not sadness. It was a terrifying, ancient intensity. It was the look of someone who had walked through fire to deliver a message. Elias raised his hand. It was a sharp, commanding gesture. Stop. Officer Miller froze. The courtroom froze. The silence that Elias lived in suddenly seemed to expand, swallowing the entire room. Why did he stop them? He despised disorder. He despised theatrics. Yet his hand remained raised. He wanted to see what she would do. Clara walked forward. Her sneakers were worn, the rubber peeling at the toes. She walked past the bar, past the defense table where her father was weeping silently, and stopped directly beneath the judge's bench. She was so small that Elias had to lean over to see her properly. She reached into her oversized coat pocket. The bailiff's hand drifted to his belt, a reflex. But Clara did not pull out a weapon. She pulled out a cheap plastic soprano recorder, the kind every child receives in elementary school music class. It was battered, scratched, and held together near the mouthpiece with a strip of blue electrical tape. Elias stared. Was this a joke? A final insult to the dignity of his court? Clara brought the instrument to her lips. Her fingers, trembling slightly, found their positions over the holes. She took a deep breath, her small chest expanding. She played. To Elias, it was pantomime. He saw the puff of her cheeks. He saw her fingers lift and fall in a deliberate sequence. He saw the throat of the instrument vibrate, but he heard nothing, just the tinnitus, just the silence. She played 3 notes, short, ascending, a simple triad. Then she lowered the recorder. With her other hand, she reached into her pocket again and pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper. She held it up high, standing on her tiptoes, offering it to the high bench like an offering to a silent god. Elias hesitated. Protocol dictated he ignore this. Logic dictated he have her removed, but curiosity, a sensation he thought had died years ago, pricked at him. He leaned down and took the paper. It was a drawing, done in crayon. It depicted a man in chains, Peter, and a man in a black robe, Elias, sitting on a throne. But the man in the robe had no ears. Instead of ears, there were thick grey walls drawn on the sides of his head. At the bottom, in jagged, childish handwriting, were words that Peter must have whispered to her 1,000 times in their hopeless prayers. "Hear, my father, and I will give you back your music." Elias stared at the drawing. A scoff rose in his throat. It was manipulative. It was emotional blackmail. It was everything he hated about the human element of the law. He looked up to dismiss her, to signal the bailiff to take the child away so he could finish destroying her father's life. But he didn't signal. He saw the room. The courtroom was shaking, not the floor, the people. The reporters were covering their mouths. Mark Hayes was leaning back, his head thrown back in open, convulsing laughter. The prosecutor was smirking, shaking her head in disbelief. Even the court clerk was suppressing a giggle. They were laughing. They were laughing at the mute girl. They were laughing at her cheap plastic flute. They were laughing at the absurdity of a child, thinking she could melt the ice judge with a nursery rhyme. Mockery. Elias watched the laughter ripple through the room like a contagion. It was ugly. It was distorted. Their mouths were gaping caverns of ridicule. He looked at Peter Antunes, who had buried his face in his hands, humiliated not for himself, but for his daughter. And then Elias looked at Clara. She was not looking at the laughing crowd. She was not crying. She was staring at Elias with a ferocity that burned. She raised the recorder again. She did not retreat. She defied the laughter. She defied the logic. She defied the silence. She played the 3 notes again. 1, 2, 3. And then the world broke. It started as a pressure in the center of Elias's skull, a physical spike of pain so sharp he gasped, dropping the drawing. And then, cutting through the thick grey cotton of 10 years of deafness, it came. Toot! Toot, toot. It wasn't a vibration. It wasn't a feeling. It was sound. It was raw, high-pitched and imperfect. It was the sound of cheap plastic vibrating against air. It was the distinct, undeniable pitch of a C major triad. Elias slammed back into his leather chair, his hands flying up to clutch the sides of his head. His eyes went wide, wide with a terror so absolute it nearly stopped his heart. He had heard it. He looked around wildly. The laughter in the room seemed to mute instantly, but not because he was deaf, because they saw his face. They saw the color drain from the judge's skin. They saw the man of stone trembling violently. Clack! The sound of his fountain pen rolling off the desk and hitting the floor. Elias heard it. He heard the dry clack of the plastic against the wood. It was impossible. His auditory nerves were severed. The doctors had said it was irreversible. The cochlea was dead. This was a biological impossibility. No, he whispered, and he heard his own voice. It sounded strange, hollow, like speaking underwater, but it was there. The vibration in his throat matched the sound in his ears. He stared at Clara. The girl slowly lowered the recorder. She did not smile. She nodded once, a grave acknowledgement of a contract signed in invisible ink. The sound began to fade. The grey curtain rushed back in. The ambient hum of the air conditioner, the shuffle of feet. He couldn't hear those. The window was closing. The miracle was evaporating as quickly as it had arrived, but the echo of those three notes remained, searing a pathway through his dormant brain. Elias's chest heaved. He was hyperventilating. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He looked at the verdict sheet in front of him. Guilt. If he could hear, if the impossible had just happened, then what else was true? If the laws of biology could be suspended by the faith of a child, could the laws of evidence be wrong? He looked at Mark Hayes. The tycoon was no longer laughing. He was frowning, staring at the judge with a look of calculating unease. Elias looked at Peter Antunes. The man was looking at his daughter with awe. Elias's hand shook uncontrollably as he reached for his gavel. He couldn't trust his senses. He couldn't trust his mind. He might be having a stroke. He might be losing his sanity. But he knew one thing, with absolute crystalline certainty. He could not send this man to prison today. Not after the silence had been broken. He couldn't hear the gavel strike the sound block. The deafness had returned as heavy as lead, but he felt the impact shudder through his arm. He grabbed his stylus and typed furiously onto the stenographer's screen, his words appearing large and bold on the monitors for the whole court to see. Sentencing postponed. Court adjourned for 48 hours, pending medical evaluation. A chaotic uproar, visual, chaotic, angry, erupted in the gallery. Mark Hayes stood up, his face red, shouting words Elias couldn't hear. The prosecutor threw her hands up, but Elias didn't care. He stood up, his legs wobbling, clutching his robe around him like a shield. He looked down at Clara one last time. The girl pocketed her recorder, turned, and walked back to her father, taking his scarred hand in hers. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. She had played her score. Elias fled the courtroom, stumbling into his chambers. He slammed the door and locked it. He leaned his back against the heavy wood, sliding down until he hit the floor. He pressed his palms against his ears, waiting, hoping, fearing. Silence. But it was different now. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. He pulled the crumpled crayon drawing from his robe pocket. He smoothed it out on his knee. The crude drawing of the man with walls for ears. How? He whispered into the empty room. How did you do that? He looked at the date circled on the calendar on his desk. He had 2 days, 48 hours, not to cure his hearing. He didn't believe that would stay, but 48 hours to figure out why a mute girl's melody was the only thing powerful enough to pierce the armor of his isolation. He stood up, shedding his robe. The heavy black garment fell to the floor, a puddle of shadow. Judge Elias Corder was gone. The man who remained was terrified, shaken, and for the first time in a decade listening. He had to find her. He had to know, because if he really had heard those notes, then Mark Hayes was lying, and Peter Antunes was innocent. And Elias had almost become a monster. He grabbed his coat. He wasn't going to the doctor, he was going to find the girl who spoke the language of the impossible. Magistrate, the silence in Judge Elias Corder's apartment was different from the silence in the courtroom. In the courtroom, the silence was heavy, pressurized by the weight of judgment and the stale air of bureaucracy. Here, in his minimalist penthouse overlooking the Boston harbor, the silence was sterile. It was the silence of a mausoleum. Elias sat at his glass dining table, a single lamp casting a harsh pool of light onto the scattered contents of the State V. Antunes file. It was 2 a.m. The storm that had battered the courthouse earlier had settled into a steady, rhythmic drizzle, visible only as shimmering streaks against the city lights outside his floor-to-ceiling windows. He held a tuning fork in his hand, a relic from his life before the explosion, back when he played the cello. He struck the fork against the edge of the table. He felt the vibration travel through the metal, into his fingertips, up his arm. He watched the tines blur with motion. He closed his eyes and strained. He pushed his mind into the auditory void, begging his dormant cochlear nerves to fire, to replicate the miracle of the courtroom. Hear it, hear the A note, nothing, only the phantom shriek of his tinnitus, mocking him. The grey cotton wool of deafness remained impenetrable. He opened his eyes and threw the tuning fork across the room. It bounced silently off the rug. The moment in the courtroom, those 3 distinct impossible notes, felt like a hallucination now, a physiological glitch caused by stress, caffeine, and the intense stare of a desperate child. But Elias Corder was a man of evidence, and he had one piece of evidence that he could not dismiss, his own reaction. He had halted a sentencing. He, the ice judge, the machine of conviction, had stopped the gears of the law because of a feeling that terrified him more than the deafness ever had. He looked down at the crayon drawing Clara had given him, the judge with the walls for ears. "Hear my father, and I will give you back your music." "It's a metaphor," Elias muttered, the vibrations of his own voice feeling foreign in his throat. "It's a childish metaphor." But then his eyes drifted to the case files, the bank statements, the receipts, the audit report signed by Mark Hayes' accountant. Elias had memorized these numbers. They added up. They were perfect, too perfect. In the chaotic aftermath of the courtroom, a thought had planted itself in his mind. If Clara Antunes was willing to walk into a federal courtroom and challenge a judge, she wasn't crazy. She was convicted, and conviction like that usually comes from knowing something no one else knows. Elias stood up. He couldn't wait 48 hours. The doubt was a parasite, eating away at his certainty. He needed to look the witness in the eye again, not from a high bench, but face to face. He grabbed his coat and the case file. He checked the address on Peter Antunes' bail release form. It wasn't the Beacon Hill address listed on his old work invoices. Peter had lost his home to legal fees months ago. The current address was a temporary housing shelter in South Boston, a grim brick building run by the city. Elias walked out into the cold night. He didn't call his driver. This wasn't official judicial business. This was a man trying to save his own sanity. During the scene, the shelter was a converted warehouse near the docks. The streetlights here were yellow and buzzing, or so they looked, flickering intermittently. The sidewalk was cracked, pooling with oily rainwater. Elias parked his luxury sedan 2 blocks away, feeling conspicuously out of place in his cashmere coat and Italian leather shoes. He walked to the entrance. A security guard sat behind a plexiglass screen, reading a magazine. Elias approached and pressed his badge against the glass. The guard looked up, startled. He mouthed something. Elias pointed to his ear, then to the badge, then to the notepad he had retrieved from his pocket. He wrote, "Peter Antunes, room 4B. The guard's eyes went wide. A federal judge in a homeless shelter at 3 a.m. He didn't ask questions. He buzzed the door open. The hallway smelled of bleach and boiled cabbage. A scent Elias remembered from his own impoverished childhood, a sensory memory that didn't need hearing to trigger. The vibration of heavy footsteps echoed in the floorboards as he climbed the stairs. Room 4B was at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. Elias hesitated before the peeling green paint of the door. This was highly irregular. It was potentially grounds for a mistrial. If Mark Hayes's lawyers found out, Elias would be disbarred. He knocked. 3 sharp raps. He waited. He felt the vibration of footsteps approaching from the other side. The door cracked open. Peter Antunes stood there. He wore a grey t-shirt and sweatpants. His face was drawn, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. When he saw Elias, his expression shifted from confusion to pure, unadulterated rage. Peter tried to slam the door. Elias shoved his foot in the gap. It was an undignified move, desperate. Peter shouted something. Elias saw the tendons in the man's neck strain and pushed harder. Elias pulled out his notepad and shoved it through the crack. On the top page, written in thick black marker, were the words, "I heard her." Peter froze. The pressure on the door lessened. He looked at the note, then at Elias's face. The anger didn't leave his eyes, but it was joined by confusion. He opened the door slowly. The room was small, a single cramped studio with 2 cots pushed against opposite walls. A small kitchenette in the corner was piled with instant noodle cups. It was a prison cell without bars. Sitting on the far cot, illuminated by the street lamp outside the window, was Clara. She was awake. She still wore the oversized woolen coat, as if she were ready to run at a moment's notice. She held the plastic recorder in her lap like a weapon. Peter stepped in front of Elias, acting as a human shield for his daughter. He spoke rapidly, his hands chopping the air. Elias raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I cannot hear you, Mr. Antunes," Elias said, his voice flat and controlled. "I read lips, but in this light it is difficult. I need to communicate with Clara." Peter shook his head violently. He pointed at the door. "Get out!" Clara stood up. She walked past her father and stood in front of the judge. She looked at him with that same unnerving intensity she had displayed in court. She reached out and took the notepad from Elias's hand. She flipped to a fresh page and picked up the pen. She wrote with the slow, deliberate focus of a child determined to be understood. She turned the pad to Elias. "You came." Elias took the pen. "Why did I hear the music, Clara? The doctors say it's impossible." Clara read it. She didn't write immediately. She looked at his ears, then at his eyes. She tapped her own chest over her heart. She wrote, "The music didn't come from your ears. It came from the truth. You were ready to listen." Elias sighed, frustration bubbling up. "I need facts, Clara. I am a judge. I deal in evidence. Magic doesn't work in my court." Clara shook her head. She looked annoyed. She grabbed the case file Elias was clutching under his arm. She pulled it from him and threw it onto the small, rickety table between the cots. She opened it. Her small fingers flipped through the pages with surprising familiarity. She bypassed the police reports, the character statements, and the photos. She went straight to the financial section. She pulled out the audit report. This was the document that had sealed Peter's fate. It was a dense spreadsheet detailing the missing funds, authorized by an independent accounting firm. Clara grabbed a red crayon from a box on the nightstand. She circled the date stamp at the top of the page. Then she flipped through the file and pulled out a work order, a log of Peter's hours at the foundation. She circled the date on that too. She pushed the 2 papers toward Elias. Elias adjusted his glasses. He looked at the audit report. Date of generation, October 14th. He looked at the work order. Project completion date, October 16th. He frowned. So, the audit was done 2 days before the project ended. That's standard. They audit ongoing accounts. Clara rolled her eyes, a gesture so normal, so childlike, it almost made Elias smile. She grabbed the notepad again. "Look at the materials list." Elias looked. The audit report listed missing inventory 50 sheets of mahogany veneer, value $12,000. Then he looked at the work order from October 16th. It contained a receipt attached to the back. Delivery of mahogany veneer, delayed due to shipping error. Received October 15th. Elias froze. The audit report, generated on October 14th, claimed the mahogany was missing and stolen by Peter, but the mahogany hadn't even been delivered to the site until October 15th. How could the auditors know the wood was missing on the 14th if it wasn't supposed to be there until the 15th? "The audit," Elias whispered. "It was pre-written." Peter Antunes, seeing the realization on the judge's face, stepped forward. He tapped the paper vigorously. He pointed to Mark Hayes's signature at the bottom of the funding request. Elias looked closer. The audit wasn't just premature, it was prophetic. It listed thefts of materials that hadn't yet arrived at the warehouse. It was a fabrication created before the alleged crime timeline was even complete. They didn't audit the books, Elias said, his mind racing. They wrote a script. They decided you were guilty before the materials were even delivered. He looked up at Peter. Why didn't your lawyer catch this? Peter grabbed the notepad. He wrote in angry, jagged block letters, "Lawyer works for public defender, overworked. Hayes buried him in paperwork." 5,000 pages. No one looked at the dates. Elias felt a cold chill settle in his stomach. It was a classic paper dump. The prosecution, funded by Hayes's influence, had drowned the defense in so much discovery material that the simple, glaring chronological error was hidden in a mountain of noise. And Elias, the perfect judge, had missed it too. He had been looking at the totals, checking the math, verifying the statutes. He had been reading the letter of the law, but he hadn't been reading the story. He looked at Clara. She was watching him, holding the recorder loosely in her hand. "You knew," Elias said. Clara nodded. She pointed to her eyes. "I see." She wrote on the pad, "My dad didn't steal. Mr. Hayes needed the money for the other building. I heard him on the phone when I was waiting for Dad." Elias stared at the note. "The other building?" Peter intervened, taking the pen. "Hayes is building a casino in the Harbor District. He's over-leveraged. He drained the charity to pay his contractors. He needed a scapegoat to explain the missing cash to the IRS. He picked the carpenter. It fit. It fit perfectly. It was a narrative of greed and convenience, far more plausible than the story of a devoted father suddenly turning into a thief." Elias looked at the father and daughter. They were huddled together in a cold room, crushed by a system he represented. And yet, this mute girl had been the only one brave enough to try and break the silence. Elias took the pen. He wrote slowly, pressing hard into the paper. "I cannot use this yet. If I introduce this now, Hayes will claim it's a clerical error. He will destroy the original digital logs before we can subpoena them. We need the original metadata from the Foundation's server." He looked at Peter. "I need to get into the Foundation's records, officially." Peter shook his head. "Impossible. Hayes has private security, top grade." Clara tapped Elias's arm. She held up a drawing she had just made. It was a picture of a computer, and next to it, a picture of a janitor's bucket and a picture of Peter. Peter looked at the drawing and sighed. He signed something to Clara. She signed back, emphatic. Peter turned to Elias. He wrote, "I still have the keys. I didn't just fix the wood, I fixed the doors. I know the maintenance override codes for the alarm, but I can't go in. I'm on bail. If I get within 500 feet, the ankle monitor goes off." Elias looked at the keys hanging on a hook by the door. Old brass keys. "You can't go," Elias said. He stood up, buttoning his cashmere coat. The realization of what he was about to say made his heart hammer against his ribs. He was a federal judge. He was the embodiment of the establishment. And he was about to suggest a felony. "You can't go," Elias repeated, "but I can." Peter looked at him as if he were insane. "You." "I am a judge," Elias said, his voice gaining a steely edge. "I can issue a warrant, but a warrant takes time, and it warns the target. Hayes will wipe the servers the moment he sees a subpoena." He looked at Clara. "You said I only heard the music because I was ready to hear the truth. Well, I am listening now." He turned to Peter. "Give me the codes. Tell me where the server room is." Peter hesitated. This was madness, trusting the man who almost sent him to prison. But he looked at Clara. She was nodding. She trusted this broken man. Peter grabbed a napkin and wrote down a sequence of numbers and a floor plan. Basement level, behind the boiler room, server rack 3. Elias took the napkin. He tucked it into his pocket next to the crayon drawing. "If I do this," Elias said, "I am no longer a judge. I am a co-conspirator." Clara walked up to him. She reached out and touched his hand, the hand that held the gavel. Her hand was warm. She signed one word. Peter translated it aloud, his voice rough with emotion, though Elias couldn't hear it. He read the lips perfectly. "Partner," Elias nodded. He turned to the door. "Stay here," he ordered. "If I am not back in 2 hours, call the public defender." Elias walked out of the shelter and back into the rain. The silence of the night felt different now. It wasn't empty anymore, it was vibrating with tension. He sat in his car, looking at the napkin. He wasn't going to the courthouse. He was going to the Beacon Hill Arts Foundation. He was going to break into a building. For 10 years, Elias Corder had been a ghost in his own life, haunting the halls of justice. Tonight, for the first time, he felt alive. He touched his ear. He couldn't hear the rain drumming on the roof of the car, but he could imagine the sound. And in his mind, it sounded like a C major triad. He started the engine. The silent score was about to reach its crescendo. The basement of the Beacon Hill Arts Foundation was a labyrinth of shadows and humming machinery. Judge Elias Corder, a man who had spent the last decade in the pristine, well-lit sanctuary of the courtroom, now found himself crouching behind a stack of dusty crates, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He checked his watch. 3:48 a.m. He felt the vibration of the boiler kicking on, a deep, rhythmic thrumming in the concrete floor. To a hearing person, the noise would have been deafening. To Elias, it was just a trembling in his knees. He held Peter's napkin in one hand and a high-capacity flash drive in the other. He had bypassed the external alarm using the maintenance code Peter provided. It had worked. But the silence of his world made every shadow look like a security guard. He couldn't hear footsteps. He couldn't hear the creak of a door. He had to rely entirely on his peripheral vision, snapping his head left and right like a paranoid animal. He found the server room door. It was heavy, steel-reinforced. He punched in the keypad sequence, 7-2-4-9-1. The light on the lock blinked green. Click. He felt the latch release. Elias slipped inside. The room was bathed in the alien blue glow of LED status lights. Banks of servers hummed in the darkness, the brain of Mark Hayes's empire. Elias located rack 3. He found the USB port. His hands, usually so steady when signing warrants, were shaking violently as he inserted the drive. A window popped up on the terminal screen. Password required. Elias cursed silently. Peter hadn't given him a server password. He only had the door codes. He stared at the blinking cursor. He was a judge, not a hacker. He was out of his depth. He thought of Peter in that cold shelter room. He thought of Clara's fierce, demanding eyes. Think like the criminal. Mark Hayes was a narcissist. Elias had read the psychological profiles in the case file. Men like Hayes didn't use random strings of characters. They used monuments to their own ego. Elias tried Hayes Foundation, access denied. He tried Beacon Hill, access denied. He tried the date of the building's opening. Access denied. Sweat stung his eyes. One more attempt before the system locked him out. He closed his eyes, trying to remember the details of the file. He remembered a photo of Hayes's office. On the wall, prominent and framed, was not a picture of his wife or children, but a blueprint of his new casino project, the Harbor Point. Elias typed Harbor Point. Access granted. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He navigated to the Financial Logs Audit folder. He saw the files. Original V1, Original V2, and finally Audit Final Cleaned. He dragged everything to the flash drive. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 10%, 40%. Suddenly, a red light began to flash on the ceiling. Elias didn't hear the siren. He didn't hear the alarm blaring through the building. He only saw the room pulsating with a strobing crimson light. Silent alarm. He had triggered a digital tripwire. 70%. He looked at the door. Had he locked it? He couldn't remember. He watched the screen. 90%. The door handle turned. Elias yanked the drive out at 99%. Corrupted? Maybe. Enough? Hopefully. He dove behind the server rack just as the door swung open. Two private security guards, bulky men in tactical vests, burst in with flashlights. They swept the beams across the room. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, pressing himself into the dust and cables. He felt the vibration of their heavy boots slamming against the floor. They were shouting. He could feel the percussive blasts of their voices in the air pressure. One guard walked right past his hiding spot. The beam of the flashlight missed Elias's shoe by an inch. The guard moved to the terminal, checking the screen. He pulled a radio from his belt. Elias saw his chance. The door was still open. The guards were focused on the computer. He didn't run. Running created vibration. He moved with the agonizing slowness of a shadow. He slipped out the door into the hallway, and then he sprinted. He ran through the boiler room, up the maintenance stairs, and burst out into the alleyway rain. He didn't stop until he reached his car. He threw himself into the driver's seat, his chest heaving, his hands clutching the plastic drive so hard his knuckles were white. He had the truth, but now they knew he had it. Dees at the penthouse, 5:30 a.m. Elias's apartment was a fortress of glass and steel, usually a place of solitude. Now it was a war room. He had picked up Peter and Clara from the shelter immediately after the heist. It was too dangerous to leave them there. If Hayes's men checked the security footage, they wouldn't see a judge. They would see a thief, and Hayes would go after the weak link. Now Peter sat at Elias's dining table, analyzing the data on a laptop. Clara was curled up on the expensive Italian leather sofa, still wearing her coat, watching the rain streak the panoramic windows. Elias paced the room. He had already drafted the affidavit. With the original files showing the edits to the inventory logs, he could have a federal warrant signed by 9 a.m. He just needed to survive until the courthouse opened. Peter waved at him. Elias walked over. Peter pointed to the screen. It was a metadata log. User M. Hayes. Action, delete row 404490. Date Oct 14. He deleted the delivery confirmation, Elias said, reading the screen. He deleted the evidence that the wood arrived late. Peter nodded, grim satisfaction on his face. He typed on the laptop. This proves everything. It proves the theft was impossible. We have him, Elias said. We just need to... The lights in the apartment cut out. The sudden darkness was absolute. The city lights outside provided a weak ambient glow, turning the furniture into hulking silhouettes. Elias froze. A power outage? In this building? Unlikely. He felt a vibration in the floor. Heavy, rhythmic. Not the boiler this time. Footsteps. He looked at the front door. The electronic lock panel was dead. Peter stood up, grabbing a heavy marble bookend from the table. He moved in front of Clara. The front door didn't open. Instead, the glass of the balcony door, 30 floors up, shattered inward. Elias didn't hear the crash. He saw the glass explode like diamonds in the moonlight. He saw two figures repel into the room, dressed in black, faces covered. Mercenaries, Peter charged. He was a strong man, a laborer, but he was tired and untrained. One of the intruders, a man the size of a linebacker, caught Peter's swing effortlessly. He struck Peter in the stomach with a baton, a silent, brutal impact that folded the carpenter in half. Peter collapsed, gasping. The intruder zip-tied Peter's hands before he could recover. Clara scrambled backward over the sofa, disappearing behind the kitchen island. Elias stood his ground. He was a judge. This was his sanctuary. "Get out of my house!" he shouted, though he couldn't hear his own volume. A third figure stepped in from the balcony. He wasn't wearing a mask. It was Mark Hayes. Hayes looked impeccable, even in the chaos. He brushed glass shards off his cashmere shoulder. He walked up to Elias, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He held a pistol, a suppressed 9mm. Hayes said something. Elias stared at his lips. "Give me the drive." Elias kept his face impassive. "I don't know what you're talking about." Hayes stepped closer. He raised the gun and pointed it at Peter, who was groaning on the floor. "The drive, Elias, or the carpenter dies first." Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out the flash drive. He held it up. Hayes smiled and reached for it. Elias threw it. He hurled it over Hayes's head, across the room, toward the open balcony door. It skittered across the floor and vanished into the dark corners of the terrace. Hayes's face twisted in fury. He signaled his men. "Find it!" The two thugs began tearing the apartment apart. They overturned tables, ripped cushions, smashed vases. Hayes turned back to Elias. He pressed the gun barrel against Elias's forehead. Elias felt the cold ring of steel. He looked into Hayes's eyes and saw no humanity there, just the calculation of a ledger being balanced. Hayes moved his lips. "You're a deaf cripple, Elias. No one will miss you. A break-in gone wrong. A tragedy." Elias closed his eyes. He thought of his wife. He thought of the silence. He prepared for the end, but the shot didn't come. Instead, Elias felt the floor shake. It was a sharp, biting vibration. Thump, thump, thump. Hayes frowned. He looked around. He seemed annoyed by a noise Elias couldn't hear. The vibration came again. Stronger this time. It was rhythmic, urgent, clang, clang, clang. Elias opened his eyes. Hayes was looking toward the kitchen. The noise was distracting him. Behind the kitchen island, hidden from the men but visible to Elias in the reflection of the oven door, was Clara. She had pulled out the largest pot from the rack, a heavy copper stock pot. She had grabbed a metal meat tenderizer, and she was smashing the tenderizer against the pot with every ounce of strength in her small body. To Elias, it was a silent movie. He saw her arm blur with speed. He saw the dent forming in the copper, but to Hayes and his men, it must have been excruciating. A deafening metallic shriek echoing off the glass walls and marble floors, a sound designed to wake the dead. Hayes shouted something, probably telling her to stop. He turned away from Elias, distracted, aiming the gun toward the kitchen. No, Elias didn't think. He didn't analyze. He didn't weigh the evidence. He lunged. He tackled Mark Hayes. Elias was older, and he wasn't a fighter, but he had the element of surprise and the weight of 10 years of repressed rage. They crashed to the floor. The gun skittered away. Hayes punched Elias in the jaw. A burst of white light exploded in Elias's vision. He tasted copper, but he held on. He gripped Hayes's lapels, dragging him down. The two mercenaries abandoned their search and rushed to help their boss. One of them kicked Elias in the ribs. The pain was blinding. Elias gasped, his grip loosening. They hauled Elias off Hayes and threw him against the wall. He slid down, clutching his side. He watched helplessly as Hayes stood up, smoothing his suit, his face contorted with murder. Hayes picked up the gun. He walked over to the kitchen island. He reached over and grabbed Clara by her hair, dragging her out. The girl was still holding the meat tenderizer. She wasn't crying. She was kicking, biting, fighting like a wild animal. Hayes raised the gun to the back of her head. Elias screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound that tore his throat. "No!" Hayes looked at Elias. He smirked. He wanted Elias to see this. He wanted the judge to watch the verdict being carried out. But then the room flashed red and blue. Lights. Spinning lights reflecting off the wet glass of the balcony. Hayes froze. Elias felt the vibration of the front door being battered. Not unlocked. Battered. Boom! The heavy oak door splintered inward. Tactical lights cut through the gloom. Uniformed officers swarmed the apartment, weapons drawn. "Police! Drop the weapon!" Elias couldn't hear the command, but he saw the result. The mercenaries dropped to their knees, hands behind their heads. Hayes hesitated. For a split second, he looked at Clara, then at the police. He knew it was over. The noise. Clara's racket had traveled through the ventilation, through the walls, waking every neighbor on the floor. Someone had called 911 about shots fired or domestic violence. Hayes dropped the gun. An officer tackled him, pinning him to the expensive rug. Clara scrambled away, crawling across the floor. She didn't go to her father. She crawled straight to Elias. Elias was slumped against the wall, bleeding from the mouth, clutching his broken ribs. He looked at the girl. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading, leaving only the terror of a child. She reached out and touched his face. Her small, cold fingers traced the bruise on his jaw. Elias looked at her. He wanted to tell her she was safe. He wanted to tell her she was the bravest person he had ever met. He tried to speak, but he was coughing. Clara reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out the recorder. She pulled out the crayon. She wrote on the floor, on the polished hardwood, right next to his leg, "Thank you." Elias shook his head weakly. He took the crayon from her. His hand was shaking, covered in blood and dust. He wrote back, "You saved me." He looked at Peter, who was being helped up by a paramedic. Peter looked at Elias and nodded, a deep, respectful bow of one father to another. Elias let his head rest against the wall. The chaos of the police securing the scene, the flashing lights, the handcuffed billionaire being dragged away, it was all a silent ballet. He closed his eyes. He checked his internal world, still silent. The miracle of the hearing hadn't returned. The banging of the pot, the gunshots, if there were any, the sirens, he had heard none of it. But as he felt Clara's small hand gripping his, anchoring him to the earth, Elias realized something profound. He didn't need to hear the music to feel the rhythm of justice. He felt it in the vibration of the floorboards as the police marched Hayes away. He felt it in the pulse of the girl's hand. The battle was won, but the score wasn't finished. There was still the final movement to play. Judge Renes noticed the morning of the retrial. The sky over Boston finally cleared. The relentless grey sheet of rain that had shrouded the city for days broke apart, allowing sharp, brilliant shafts of autumn sunlight to pierce the clouds. Judge Elias Corder stood in his chambers, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He looked different. The bruising on his jaw from the fight in the penthouse had bloomed into a dark, purple contusion. He moved stiffly, his ribs bound tightly with medical tape beneath his dress shirt. He was in pain, a dull, throbbing ache that radiated through his torso with every breath. But for the first time in a decade, the man in the mirror didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a survivor. He picked up his robe. For years, this garment had been his armor, a shield against a chaotic world he couldn't hear. Today, it felt lighter. He put it on, not to hide, but to finish what he had started. He walked into the courtroom. The atmosphere was electric. Word of Mark Hayes' arrest had dominated the morning news cycle. The gallery was overflowing, not just with reporters, but with citizens, people who had heard the rumors of the deaf judge who had turned vigilante to save a carpenter. Elias ascended the bench. He sat down. He didn't look at the screen for the transcription. He looked directly at the defense table. Peter Antunes sat there, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that was clearly borrowed but worn with dignity. Next to him sat Clara. She wasn't shrinking into her coat today. She sat upright, her hands folded on her lap, watching Elias with that same piercing, ancient intelligence. Elias reached for his gavel. He struck the sound block. Whack! He felt the vibration travel up his arm, familiar and grounding. He looked at the prosecutor, Ms. Dalloway. She stood up, looking humbled. She didn't wait for the text to scroll. She spoke into the microphone, and Elias read her lips perfectly. Your Honor, in light of the new evidence provided, the Commonwealth moves to dismiss all charges against Peter Antunes with prejudice. Elias nodded. He picked up his pen, but instead of writing on the silent screen, he leaned forward toward the microphone. He hadn't spoken in court in 10 years. His voice was rusty, unused to the acoustics of the room, but it was steady. Motion granted, Elias said. His voice boomed through the speakers, startling the gallery. The charges are dismissed. Mr. Antunes, you are a free man. The courtroom erupted. This time, Elias didn't need to hear it to know what was happening. He saw Peter collapse into his chair, sobbing. He saw the lawyers shaking hands. He saw the reporters typing furiously. But Elias wasn't done. Sit down, he commanded. The room quieted, confused. We are not finished, Elias said. Justice is not just the absence of a wrongful conviction. It is the presence of truth. He held up the flash drive, the battered piece of plastic that had almost cost him his life. This court has reviewed evidence implicating Mark Hayes in systemic fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Let the record show that the system failed Peter Antunes, and let the record show that it was saved not by a judge and not by a lawyer. He pointed a shaking finger at the small girl in the front row, but by the courage of a child who refused to be silenced. Elias looked at Clara. Clara Antunes, please approach the bench. The room held its breath. Clara slid off her chair. She walked down the aisle. her sneakers squeaking on the floor, a sound Elias imagined vividly. She stood before him, just as she had days ago. Elias stood up. He walked down the steps of the bench, descending from his high perch to stand on the floor, eye to eye with her. The bailiffs tensed, but Elias waved them off. He knelt down on one knee, wincing as his broken ribs protested. He was now at her eye level. The courtroom was dead silent. The cameras were zooming in. "You gave me back my honor," Elias said softly, his voice trembling. "I can never repay that." Clara looked at him. Her eyes were wet. She reached into her pocket, but she didn't pull out the recorder. She didn't pull out a crayon. She reached out with both hands and placed them over Elias's ears. Her palms were warm. She pressed firmly, closing his world off, muffling the tinnitus, grounding him. Elias closed his eyes. He felt the pulse in her fingertips. Thump, 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 thump. He remembered the doctors. Nerve damage. Irreversible. The cochlea is dead. But he also remembered the night in the penthouse. The adrenaline. The shock. The moment he tackled Hayes. The doctors had said that sometimes trauma locks a door that isn't truly walled over. Sometimes functional deafness is a fortress the mind builds to survive grief. Clara leaned forward. Her forehead touched his. And then she pulled her hands away sharply, like a magician revealing a trick. Pop! It sounded like a gunshot inside Elias's head. A wet, pressurized pop, followed by a rush of static white noise. Elias gasped, falling back onto his heels. He grabbed his head. Hiss, whir, hum. It was chaos. It was painful. It was the sound of the air conditioning unit roaring like a jet engine. It was the sound of fabric rustling. It was the sound of a cough in the back row sounding like a thunderclap. His brain, starved of input for a decade, was suddenly drowning in data. It wasn't perfect hearing. It was distorted, metallic, overwhelming. But it was there. He looked up at Clara, his eyes wide with shock. Tears streamed down his face. "Clara?" he whispered. Clara smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile. A true, radiant smile that broke the solemn mask she had worn for months. She took a deep breath. Her throat worked. She hadn't spoken since the SWAT raid. Her vocal cords were tight with disuse. She looked directly into Elias's eyes and whispered one word: "Justice." Elias heard it. He heard the sibilance of the S, the hard click of the T. It was faint, raspy, and small. But to Elias Corder, it was the most beautiful symphony ever composed. He broke. The ice judge crumbled. He pulled the girl into a hug, burying his face in her small shoulder, weeping openly in front of the entire city of Boston. He sobbed for his wife. He sobbed for the 10 years of silence. He sobbed for the gratitude that swelled in his chest. Above them, the gallery exploded into applause, and Elias Corder heard every single clap. Just 3 weeks later, the smell of sawdust was rich and earthy, filling the air of the small rented workshop in South Boston. Sunlight danced through the dust motes floating in the air. Peter Antunes stood at a workbench, planing a piece of cherry wood. The shh sound of the plane against the grain was rhythmic and soothing. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked toward the corner of the shop. Elias sat on a stool. He wasn't wearing a robe. He was wearing a cable-knit sweater and jeans. He held a cello between his knees, an instrument he hadn't touched since the accident. His hearing aid, a sleek, modern device the doctors had fitted him with, hummed slightly. His hearing wasn't perfect. The high frequencies were gone, and background noise was still a challenge, but he could hear the world. He could hear the cars outside. He could hear the wind, and he could hear Clara. Clara sat on a crate opposite him. She held her plastic recorder. "Ready?" Elias asked. His voice was lighter now. The harsh edge of bitterness sanded away. Clara nodded. "Ready," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but it was growing stronger every day. Elias raised his bow. His hand trembled slightly, muscle memory fighting against 10 years of atrophy. But as he placed the bow on the A string, he felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. 1, 2, 3, he counted. Clara played. Toot, toot, toot. The 3 simple notes, C, E, G. Elias drew his bow across the strings. The cello groaned, deep and resonant, catching the notes and holding them up, wrapping a rich, mournful harmony around the child's simple melody. It wasn't Mozart. It wasn't perfect. There were squeaks and missed beats, but they played together, the judge and the girl, the law and the truth. Peter stopped working to listen. He watched them, the man who had almost destroyed him and the daughter who had saved them both. They finished the phrase. The final note hung in the air, vibrating in the sawdust, vibrating in the wood, vibrating in Elias's bones. Elias lowered the bow. He looked at Clara. That was a C major triad, Elias said, smiling. The chord of resolution. Clara lowered her recorder. It means happy ending? She asked. Elias looked at the sunlight streaming through the window. He listened to the distant sound of a siren. No longer a threat, just a part of the city's song. No, Elias said softly. It doesn't mean the end. It means the dissonance is resolved. It means we are in tune again. Clara hopped off the crate. Teach me the next part? Elias laughed, a sound that rang clear and true. Okay, measure 4, but you have to listen carefully. I always listen, Clara said. Elias nodded. I know, and now, so do I. He lifted the bow again. The music began anew, filling the small workshop with a sound that was louder than silence, stronger than fear, and sweeter than justice.